She didn't ask for the mic. She didn't raise her hand. She just stood there at the back of the briefing room while Colonel Vickers read the names out loud, and when he skipped hers, she didn't flinch. That was the first thing anyone noticed about Warrant Officer Nadine Sharpe, not the citations, not the 3 operational deployments to high-altitude terrain before she was 29. What people noticed first was how still she could be, the kind of still that makes a room uncomfortable. The Northern Training Facility at CFB Wainwright sits on the edge of a landscape that seems designed to remind you of your own smallness. Prairie flattening out in every direction, the sky pressing down in winter like a lid on a pot. January there isn't cold the way Toronto is cold. It's a different category of cold. The kind that makes metal brittle and judgment slower, and ambition feel like a luxury you can't afford. The kind of cold that strips things back to what they actually are. Sharpe had been stationed there for 11 days when she first heard the phrase observer category. It came from Warrant Officer Belshaw, a broad-shouldered man from Trenton who had the particular habit of repeating things twice, as though the repetition confirmed them. Observer category, he said to his table at dinner. Observer category. He shook his head. Command puts a woman in observer category. What does that tell you? The table knew what it was supposed to tell them. Sharpe was 3 tables away. She heard every word. She put her fork down, then picked it back up. Then she kept eating. The Advanced Long-Range Marksmanship course at Wainwright was not officially a competitive program. The instructor said this at the orientation. Captain Rennick said it plainly. This is not a competition. You are here to be assessed, to be developed, to return to your units better than you arrived. He said it looking at the room generally, not at any person specifically, the way officers learn to address a space when they want their words to land without a target. But everything about the structure told the real story. There were 18 candidates, 12 shooting slots per day, 6 observers. The observers didn't shoot. They tracked. They logged. They stood behind the line in their cold weather gear and watched the others cycle through the stations. And their assessment notes went into the file that would determine whether they advanced or were sent back. Sharpe had been placed in observer category without explanation. She'd received the assignment the same way everyone received their assignments. A printed sheet slid under the door of the quarters block before ZO 500. Name, bunk assignment, watch rotation, role designation. Hers said OC next to her name. She'd stared at it for longer than she'd intended. Then she'd folded it into her breast pocket and gone to find coffee. That was Nadine. She processed things privately. She'd learned early that performing emotion is different from having it, and she'd spent a long time learning not to perform. The first week, she observed, that was her assignment, and she did it thoroughly. She had a notebook, a real one, not a tablet, because in that kind of cold batteries were unreliable, and she didn't trust things she couldn't trust, and she wrote in it constantly. Wind vectors, barrel temperature and how it drifted. The way candidate Thornhill let his shots 2 degrees left, man, when the crosswind came from the north. How he compensated instinctively but slightly overcorrected. How that correction cost him 4 centimeters at 800 meters. She noted it. She noted everything. Rennick watched her note-taking from the platform once and said nothing. The senior range instructor, a lean and quiet man named Warrant Officer Croft, watched her do it twice and the second time walked over. "What are you writing?" he asked. "Environmental data and shooter tendencies." "We have instruments for that. The instruments don't record Thornhill leading left into a north crosswind." Croft looked at her for a moment. He had the kind of face that had stopped expressing things carelessly years ago. "Observer category doesn't require analytical notes," he said. "I know," said Sharpe. He left. She kept writing. The conversation that changed the geometry of everything happened on the 9th day at 1340 hours in the administrative corridor between the main range building and the equipment cage. Sharpe wasn't meant to hear it. Nobody who matters is ever meant to hear the conversation that changes everything. That's how those conversations work. They happen in the corridors, in the margin between official spaces where accountability gets thin. Colonel Vickers was talking to Captain Rennick. Sharpe was returning a radio to the cage, and the corridor carried sound the way cold corridors do, flat and clear and unforgiving. "She's not here to shoot," Vickers said. She's here because the optics required it. We had to put a female name on the advanced course intake or the equity review flags us again. That's the beginning and the end of it. A pause. Rennick's voice lower. She's going to notice she's never going to get a shooting slot. She already knows. She's smart enough to know. She just doesn't know there's nothing she can do about it. Sharpe stood in the corridor with the radio in her hand, and the cold pressing through the walls. She was aware of her own heartbeat, not racing, just present. Pronounced. She counted 4 beats, then 5. Then she went and returned the radio and signed the log sheet with her full name, clear and unambiguous, the way she'd signed every document she'd ever been given. What Colonel Vickers did not know, what most people who underestimate a specific kind of quiet person never think to find out, was what Nadine Sharpe had done before Wainwright. She had come out of Gagetown at 23 with a long-range qualification that her instructors had described, in the formal assessment language that tries not to sound impressed, as atypical. She had spent 2 years embedded with a surveillance unit in conditions that never made it into the official record, but that the people who'd been there didn't forget. She had a calculation method she'd developed herself, a hybrid of standard doping tables and a meteorological model she'd adapted from atmospheric physics literature that accounted for variables most snipers didn't bother with until they were already correcting for a miss. She didn't talk about this. The people who'd seen it work knew. The people who hadn't seen it had no reason to care. Vickers had read her file. He'd read it the way people read files when they've already decided what they mean, looking for the boxes checked, not the story between them. On the 10th night, Sharpe sat on her bunk and did the kind of thinking that doesn't get a name, not strategy, not planning. Something quieter. She thought about what she wanted, not in the way people want outcomes, but in the way they want to be able to live with themselves afterward. She wanted a shooting slot. That was honest. She wanted to demonstrate what she knew, not because she needed Vickers to see her, but because there were people on this course. Thornhill, Specialist Adjaye, the young sergeant from Petawawa named Kwan who clearly had something real, and she could help them if she was allowed to function. She could see things they couldn't see yet, not because she was better, but because she'd made different mistakes already, and those mistakes had taught her. She also wanted the record. She hadn't said that out loud, but she was aware that the corridor conversation had been between 2 officers who believed they were unheard, and that unheard conversations leave no documentation, and that the absence of documentation is itself a kind of architecture, a structure built specifically to make certain things impossible to prove. She opened her notebook and began to write, not field notes this time, a running account, dated, time-stamped where she could, from memory where she couldn't, what she'd heard, where she'd been standing, what radio she'd been returning, and to what cage and what the log would show. She wrote for an hour. When she was done, she read it back once, the way she read everything once, looking for the places where feeling had leaked into fact and cleaning them out. She wasn't writing a complaint. She was writing a record. There was a difference, and it mattered. On the 11th day, something happened that Vickers hadn't scheduled. Range Instructor Croft posted the afternoon shoot order on the board at 0730, and Sharpe's name was on it, not in observer rotation, in shooting rotation. Position 7, 0600-meter stage. No one knew how it got there. Sharpe herself found out at 0732 when candidate Thornhill came to find her in the equipment room and said, in his flat Manitoba way, "Your name's on the board." Like he was reporting weather, she thanked him and went to look. It was there, her name, her number, her assigned range position. Later, much later, after the events that followed, Croft would say that he'd made an administrative decision, within his authority as senior range instructor, to rotate a candidate out of observer status for assessment purposes. This was technically accurate. It was also a decision that required a clarity of purpose that most people in his position would not have possessed, because the informal pressure in that building, the weight of Vickers' assumptions, and the culture they produced was real and continuous, and not invisible to anyone who had to live inside it. Croft was not a crusader. He was a range instructor who had watched someone take careful notes for 11 days and had decided that what she had written deserved a test. That distinction matters. Courage, when it finally shows up, is often less dramatic than the moment it makes possible. At 1400 hours, Sharpe took position 7. The conditions were not ideal. The wind off the prairie had shifted 3 times in the preceding hour, which the instruments registered, but which instruments register the way a photograph captures a face? Technically, but without the texture. The temperature had dropped 4 degrees since morning. The light was flat. The sky, the particular white-gray that the prairies produce in January, the kind of light that removes contrast and makes distance hard to read. She lay behind the rifle and breathed. She did the calculation that she did before every shot. Not the one the program taught, though that was in there too, but the deeper one. The one that accounted for the specific temperature differential between the air at her position and the air at the target, for the barrel temperature given the 3 shots that had gone before, for the way the wind had been trending rather than where it was at this exact moment. Most shooters correct for where the wind is. She'd learned from a miss that had cost something real, in a context she didn't talk about, to correct for where the wind was going. She exhaled halfway, let the breath settle, took the shot. The impact registered at point of aim. 800 meters. Wind shift. Temperature drop. Point of aim. Croft, standing behind the firing line, said nothing. He marked his board. She took the second shot. The wind had shifted another 1.5 degrees in the 12 seconds since the first. She had already adjusted. The second impact registered 2 centimeters left of the first, exactly where she had aimed. Croft made another mark. Beside him, a warrant officer from the evaluation team who Sharpe didn't know by name had stopped writing. The third shot was at 100 meters. It was not a standard stage distance. It was not on the programmatic assessment criteria. Croft had added it that morning, also within his authority, because there are range instructors who understand that assessment criteria are floors, not ceilings, and that what you learn above the ceiling is the most important thing. At 100 meters, in flat January light, with a shifting wind and a barrel that had cycled through heat and cold 3 times in 40 minutes, Sharpe made the calculation that most of the candidates on the course hadn't yet reached in their conceptual development. She wasn't showing off. She was solving a problem. That's the distinction between someone performing skill and someone using it, the presence or absence of a problem they're genuinely trying to solve. The third shot landed. Croft put his pen down. The warrant officer from the evaluation team said quietly, to no one in particular, "What stage is that?" "Supplementary," Croft said. "Supplementary isn't scored." "Not officially," Croft said. Vickers found out at 16:30. By that time, Sharpe was back in observer rotation. Her appearance in the shooting order had been, officially, a single-session assessment, temporary administrative, and the course was running its afternoon debriefs in the usual format. Vickers called Rennick into his office, and this conversation also happened in a space where it was not expected to be heard. But Sharpe was not present for this one. What she knew was what Croft told her at 1800 hours in the equipment room while she was returning the rifle. "The evaluation team noted your performance," he said. "I saw them writing. Vickers is going to say the supplementary stage isn't on record. Is that true?" Croft was quiet for a moment. He had the kind of integrity that doesn't announce itself and doesn't require an audience. "The evaluation team has their own notes," he said. "Those go to the regional assessment office, not through this command structure." Sharpe processed this. "The camera," she said, the word she used for any documentation that existed outside the chain of control, the record that couldn't be reached. "It's not a camera," Croft said. "It's a process." "But yes, okay," she said. She handed him the rifle, properly cleared, action open. "Thank you for the stage. You earned the stage." She put her notebook in her breast pocket and went to dinner. In the days that followed, Vickers moved quickly, the way people move when they understand that speed is the only tool they have left. He reassigned Sharpe to a different evaluation cohort, a procedural shuffle that looked administrative and was supposed to dilute the record by separating her performance from the standard scoring track. He spoke to Rennick twice more. These conversations shorter and more clipped than the previous ones. The kind of conversations that happen when a plan is being revised under pressure and the revisions are not producing confidence. What Vickers had not modeled, And this is the part that matters. This is where the architecture of the trap turned out to have an error, was the evaluation team. He had assumed the evaluation team was his, not because anyone had told him so, because he'd been in command of this facility for 3 years, and the evaluation team had come through on 7 previous courses, and on all 7 previous courses, the evaluation team had behaved in a way that was consistent with the command environment. He'd mistaken consistency for loyalty. Those are not the same thing. The evaluation team leader was a major from Ottawa named Sharpe, who had 22 years of operational assessment experience and a particular professional discomfort. Exactly, but a preference that had hardened into something close to principle, with the gap between what official records showed and what actually occurred on her watch. She had noticed Sharpe at position 7. She had noticed the results. She had asked Croft privately about the observer category designation, and Croft had told her the timeline, placed in observer status day 1, no documentation of reason, no performance basis, no request for voluntary non-shooting status. Sharpe had written that down in her own notes, the ones that went to Ottawa. She had also, and this was the piece that Vickers would understand only later, when understanding it no longer changed anything, spoken to 3 other candidates, informally, about what they had observed in the range environment over the preceding 11 days. Thornhill, Ajayi, Kwan from Petawawa, none of them had been asked to say anything critical. Sharpe had simply asked them to describe what they'd seen. Thornhill said she was writing things down all the time, and she was right. He thought about it. Every time I checked what she'd written against what actually happened, she was right. Ajayi said less. Ajayi had the habit of economy with words. He said she wasn't given a fair run, and then he said nothing else, and Sharpe wrote it in her notes and thanked him, and that was that. Kwan said the most. Kwan was 24 and still had the quality of saying what he thought without fully calculating the consequences first, and Sharpe had chosen to speak to him last because she'd suspected this and saved it. He said that he'd noticed, from the first day, that Sharpe was never given a shooting slot. He said he'd asked Belshaw about it, and Belshaw had used the phrase observer category twice and shrugged. He said he'd thought about it, and it didn't make sense to him because the observer category was supposed to be for candidates who requested non-shooting assessment, and he hadn't heard that she'd requested it. He said finally, in the way people say things when they're not sure if they're allowed to say them, but they're going to say them anyway. It seemed like it was decided before she arrived. Sharpe wrote that down too. Sharpe didn't know about those conversations. She found out about them the same way she found out about most things, later from the record, when the record became available. What she knew in the moment was her notebook. She'd been keeping it for 11 days, and the keeping of it had not been strategic, not exactly. It had been the same impulse that made her track Thornhill's left lead and the barrel temperature and the wind trend rather than the wind position, a habit of documentation, a belief that the thing you record has a different kind of existence than the thing you only know. You could argue with what she said. You couldn't argue with what she wrote because it was dated and specific and verifiable against other records that existed independently. She had not been making a case. She had been keeping a record because she believed that clarity was its own form of integrity, and that if something was true, it deserved to be documented, and that a truth without documentation was available to be disagreed with indefinitely. On the 14th day, she was called into a meeting with Rennick, Deschamps, and a legal officer from Edmonton, whose name she didn't catch because he didn't introduce himself clearly and she didn't ask twice. Vickers was not in the room. She noticed that. Rennick was professional and careful, and she could see that he was operating in a space that had become uncomfortable for him, that he was trying to find the place between what was accurate and what he could say without consequence, and she didn't resent him for it. That kind of navigation is hard, and most people make it harder than it has to be by trying to make the navigation invisible. Deschamps asked the questions. She asked them precisely and without editorializing, and Sharpe answered the same way. She produced the notebook when asked. She handed it to the legal officer. He read the relevant entries without expression. He asked her twice to confirm specific details. She confirmed them. She had the dates because she'd written them. She had the times because she'd written them. She had the corridor and the radio cage and the log sheet, which existed independently and would show her presence at the location at the time she'd recorded. When it was done, Deschamps said, "Thank you, Warrant Officer." Sharpe said, "Is there anything else?" Deschamps looked at her for a moment, a measuring look, the kind that isn't judgment but is assessment, the same kind of look Croft had given her on the range. "No," she said. "That's everything." The formal process that followed took 4 months. These things always take longer than they should, and less time than they feel. Vickers was removed from command of the facility in March, not publicly, not dramatically, in the administrative way these things happen, with language in the formal notice that referred to reassignment and restructuring, and that meant what it meant without ever quite saying it. The advanced course was reviewed. The observer category designation protocol was amended at the regional level to require written justification and a candidate acknowledgement form. A small change, a procedural one, the kind that looks like paperwork, until you understand that paperwork is how systems commit to their own standards. Sharpe was offered a shooting slot on the next course intake. She took it. She completed the course in the top tier. The performance wasn't the point, that is, it wasn't the proof of the point, but it was honest, and honesty had its own consistency. Quan from Petawawa finished the course in the same intake. He was a good shot, better than he thought. After the range scores posted, he came and found Sharpe and said, "How do you correct for where the wind is going?" He said it with genuine curiosity, without performance. She told him. It took 20 minutes and a piece of the back of a form she found in her pocket and a pen she borrowed from Ajay. Quan listened carefully. He asked 2 clarifying questions. She answered them. "Okay," he said. He looked at the diagram she'd made. "Okay, I think I have it. You'll miss once with it before you stop missing," she said. "That's how it works. The miss teaches you what I'm not explaining well enough." He nodded. He kept the paper. Later, months later, back in her regular posting, in a conversation with her section commander that she hadn't expected to have, she was asked what she thought had mattered most. Not the shooting, not the formal review, what had mattered. She thought about Croft posting her name on the board and what that must have cost him in terms of the small daily frictions of operating in an environment that decided things before she arrived. She thought about Thornhill saying she was right every time he checked. She thought about Quan saying what he thought before he'd calculated whether he was supposed to. She thought about her notebook, 11 days of field notes and wind readings, and the clean time-stamped record of a conversation in a cold corridor that 2 people had assumed would disappear. "The record," she said finally, "the record is what makes the truth portable." Her section commander wrote that down. He was a note-taker, too. She noticed that and didn't say anything about it, but she noticed. The prairie winter that had started all of this was, by then, a different season entirely. The facility at Wayne ran its summer intake without her name on any list that had to explain itself. Somewhere in Ottawa, in a filing system that was boring and fluorescent and exactly what accountability looks like from the inside, there was a notebook entry and a range log and an evaluation team report and an amended protocol. None of it was visible. All of it was permanent. That, as it turned out, was enough.